this is going to be a polite and respectful debate. We won't let people step on or trash each other here. That's not the purpose why we're here. We're going to start with an initial 1 to 2 minute statement from each of you, and then afterwards I'll toss questions to one of you, and then you can all respond in kind of short, pithy, non-polemical fashion. All right? Okay, so we're just going to start with Ms. Harmon and work down the line. Okay.
Hi. Thanks for coming. I feel like I've done these things before, so I'm just going to sacrifice like 20 seconds of my 2 minutes to say what genetic engineering is. So I mean, I feel like maybe because you're here, you know, but we're talking about like moving a bit of DNA from one organism into another to provide that other organism with a trait that it couldn't otherwise get through traditional breeding. Right? So, and when I started out, I reporting on this subject, which I did about 2 years ago. My interest was really just, I'm a science writer for the Times. I write about the intersection of science and society, and I try to do it through narrative form. And I was interested in food, and I was just sort of poking around and thinking, well, there's this long-running debate over genetic engineering. Is there anything new here? You know, is there something, you know, I need to produce a story for my paper. Is there any, I'm a newspaper writer. I needed something new. And I think that I found something new. I found something that sort of intrigued me, and that maybe you could show the first slide, if it is the first slide. I just have 2 slides. So the next one. We'll get to that. We'll get to that in a minute. So I don't know if you can see very well with the light, but this is a picture of orange trees in Florida being burned down because there's this awful disease that's affecting the orange groves of Florida, where Americans get, 90% of their orange juice. And oh my God, I have 30 seconds. So, and there's this disease has basically proven to be incurable by known means. It's a bacterial disease that's transmitted by an insect. So insects fly from tree to tree and infect the tree, and the oranges turn green and they're sour, and it's threatening the entire crop of oranges in Florida. So they've tried everything, and there's one company that I found there that is an orange juice producer that was trying to do a genetically engineered orange because the orange doesn't have the genetic ability to resist this bacteria. So they were looking through all other kinds of organisms, and they found one in spinach, a gene in spinach, that they could put in the orange tree, and it proved to be resistant to this disease. Now, one of the ways they were trying to control the disease now, and right now it's happening, is they're spraying lots of pesticides to try to control the insect that spreads the disease from tree to tree. So one benefit, if this were to work, and it's still in development, so it's not like definitely working, but I thought it would be interesting to try to sort of track the effort of this company to do this, because this wasn't like the kind of GMO that I had heard of before. I think people associate GMOs with they're made by Monsanto. They have to do with pesticides somehow. They increase, there's this sort of this image that they increase pesticide use, and they're owned by multinational corporations. And this was not a multinational corporation. It was doing it for a completely different reason, to save the orange crop, and with a gene from spinach. So anyway, I have only 30 seconds. I won't go into my entire story, but I did want to just quickly show the second slide. So not everybody has liked my GMO reporting. So I wrote that story. I wrote 2 other stories. One was based in Hawaii, and it was about the effort by the Big Island of Hawaii to completely ban any genetically engineered crops from being grown on the Big Island of Hawaii. And it kind of went through, it talked about the efforts of scientists in Hawaii and elsewhere to try to convince the county council on the Big Island that there was no basis in reality that they needed to be afraid for health or the environment of these GMOs. But anyway, this is just to show that it is kind of a controversial issue. You can take it off now. But this group, Food Democracy Now, photoshopped me into a bathing suit to sort of make their point that they didn't think that they felt that they didn't like my story.
In fairness, now, I'll extend a little bit your other intros, but let's try to. Yeah. Sure. Dr. Mellon.
Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to see this many people out interested in the issue. I'd like to start with a story. I got into the GE issue about 30 years ago now, working for the National Wildlife Federation. Because I had a PhD in molecular biology and one of the few folks at that time in the environmental community who was interested in this issue. I was invited by Monsanto to come out to St. Louis and to see their operation. And while I was there, I was told that, you know, you have a PhD. You're not afraid of this technology. You know what we're doing. And in fact, you ought to be one of the first to kind of back it, because this technology is going to reduce our dependence on pesticides, increase the yield, the intrinsic yield. That means on the best possible day of our foods. It's going to make it possible to not add fertilizers, water use efficiency, a whole parade of wonderfuls. And I said, well, that sounds good. We'll see. Well, 30 years later, we can see the major application of genetic engineering is to enable people to use one pesticide rather than another, because that pesticide was glyphosate. We're already there. Okay. Let me just say that it hasn't turned out to do that. It's increased pesticide use dramatically, has not produced water use efficiency, has not produced a single crop that is increased in intrinsic yield, has only produced one drought-tolerant crop. So I come away from the technology primarily disappointed. It has not delivered. Meanwhile, traditional breeding overall has continued to turn out crops that are higher yielding, drought tolerant, stress tolerant, pest tolerant, not this narrow spectrum of products that GE has turned out, all of which have to do with pesticides so far. And so I guess my position on the technology is that as we look forward and ask, what do we need to solve the challenges of this century to feed more people sustainably, GE is a bad choice. It's a weak technology that is not delivered. We need more attention paid to the powerful technology that has, and that's classical breeding.
For those of you that don't know, the herbicide, the trade name you might know she was referring to is Roundup, right?
And the chemical name is glyphosate, yes.
I'm sort of happy to be here. A couple things that I'd like to say, reacting to what others have said. First, this differentiation between genetic modification and genetic engineering. The reason there's some kind of confusion is they mean the same thing. The reason people will use the term genetic modification, that's what it's called in Europe, okay? And when you look at the law in Europe, they define it very specifically. It's functionally what we would define as genetic engineering over here. So when people try to say we've been genetically modifying organisms for thousands of years, that's not true. When we're talking about genetic engineering, it is a new technology. There's now global agreement that genetic engineering differs from conventional breeding, and that it raises enough safety issues that pre-market safety assessments should be required. This has been agreed upon at Codex Alimentarius. That's the food standards setting organization of the UN. It's jointly run by the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization. It had its 50th anniversary last year. It was an obscure UN organization until 1996, when the World Trade Organization was set up. They actually said that if there's any kind of challenge that has to do with food, they will determine that the guidelines and standards, anything that comes out of Codex, will be considered trade legal. Right? So that's the de facto global science. So the issue between 2000 and 2008, there was this, we developed all these guidelines. They did agree that there's a difference and that food should be assessed for safety before they come on the market. The US is the only developed country that does not buy into this. Our standard, which was set in 1992, it came out of the Council on Competitiveness, out of the White House, and it was actually announced our policy on May 29th, 1992 at a biotechnology industry organization gathering by then Vice President Dan Quayle. And that said genetic engineering is no different than conventional breeding. Therefore, we have not required any safety assessments. The FDA has not made any conclusions except for the Flavr Savr tomato, and we've not required any labeling. So our position is very simple. Safety assessments should be required before these crops are allowed on the market, and they should be labeled for a number of reasons. Thank you.
Dr. Enright?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here today, and my hat's off to Dave and Emma and Kate and others who are working on this museum. I've been in agriculture my entire adult life, and most of Americans just really don't know where their food comes from, so anything that we can do to increase that knowledge is fantastic. So thank you very much, and best of luck as you look to the future opening. From the industry perspective, I just have to say we're the first to say, boy, have we done not a very good job of talking about GMOs, genetic engineered products, over the last 20 years. We haven't talked about their application in agriculture. We haven't talked about their application in healthcare. Healthcare adopted genetic engineering 15 years before agriculture did, and today, all insulin, all human growth hormone, any biologic, vaccines, antibiotics, cancer therapies are genetically engineered. We also haven't done a good job at all about talking, really describing the difference. It probably won't come as a surprise to you that I disagree with Margaret, and I disagree with Michael. For us in the industry, for scientists, I'm a biochemist and a molecular biologist by training. Genetic engineering is just the newest way that plant breeders are modifying plants. We've been doing it as humans pretty much since we started farming about 10,000 years ago. And we've done through other means other than genetic engineering, we've made progressive and dramatic changes in our food supply. And in fact, today, almost everything we eat you cannot find in nature. By keeping out of this conversation as an industry, we basically are forfeiting, our story, forfeiting our side, if you will, of the conversation about GMOs. And so last year, being proud of our role in agriculture and recognizing, of course, we have nothing to hide, we launched an initiative called GMO Answers. I invite you to go to the website, gmoanswers.com. In it, our goal was to create a very public, transparent Q&A about GMOs. We asked visitors to our sites. I ask you sitting here, when folks come to our facilities, our company's facilities, we invite you to ask us anything about GMOs, our products, about our companies. And essentially, I think our goal is quite similar, perhaps, to the program this morning, Dave, in that from the industry perspective, we're inviting people, we're hopefully empowering people to make up their own minds about GMOs. I would never tell anyone what to think. All I can do is get the facts in front of folks, and consumers have to make up their own minds.
Great. So I'm going to address the first question to Ms. Harmon here, and then I want you to kind of address what she does in turn. So as a journalist, and I'll let you kind of build on what you were saying in your opening statement. I mean, it seems that it must be very difficult, and I'd like you to kind of describe unpacking an issue that's presented monolithically, but in fact has so many different facets to it. Most broadly, political, social issues versus scientific issues, and then even finer than that, consumer safety and environmental safety as separate issues, and corporate versus public good as being another one of the issues involved. So how do you unpack that as a journalist?
Right. Well, it took me a lot longer than my editors would have liked me to work on these stories for that very reason. There's so many issues, and there were so many objections to GMOs that came up in my reporting that I would have to sort of chase down and make sure. I wanted to present the full story. And as I said, so I started out writing this one story about these oranges, which I just thought, well, the idea of a genetically modified orange to resist a disease that might otherwise destroy the orange crop, that was interesting to me. That was sort of different from my typical image of a GMO. As I started to look into it more, I felt increasingly like the popular perception of this technology was skewed. And as Kathy said, I do think it's I do think the industry is sort of at fault for that. I mean, I think that they haven't, nobody's done a good job of explaining it to the public. Monsanto did pioneer genetic engineering with a soybean that was designed to tolerate this herbicide that we've already talked about that it made. So, it was definitely like, okay, Monsanto, so you're making money on this genetically modified soybean and you're making money on the herbicide that's sprayed on it. So it wasn't like a GMO that consumers could really find much to love about. It was widely adopted by farmers because it made their lives much easier and it was a more benign herbicide. And there is a National Academy of Sciences report from 2010 that found that there was a net benefit, environmental benefit to GMOs because of the actual reduction in pesticide use, which was another type of GMO that Monsanto came out with, which corn that resists that prevents insects from attacking it. Anyway, so it did get complicated. But the third story that I did, which was about what was happening in Hawaii, was really aimed at trying to raise this issue of, do we really understand, the evidence against genetic engineering? I mean, all of sort of my friends who are kind of like you guys. Like, I live in New York. I live on the Upper West Side. I have, my foodie friends. I would tell them that I was writing about GMOs, and they would say, oh, I avoid GMOs. And I really, I wanted people. Again, of course, people have a choice to do whatever they want, but I wanted them to, if that was their decision, to really understand why. And I talked to a lot of scientists, a lot of scientists. And the scientists we have on our panel are dissenting scientists from a very broad consensus that says that there is nothing sort of intrinsically dangerous about moving.
I'm going to have to let them jump in on this.
They can jump in.
I can't let, I see the.
Okay, but I just want to say that every major scientific organization in the world, like the European Union, the American Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences, has said that the genetically engineered crops on the market now are safe for human health and the environment.
All right.
Okay.
Start with Dr. Mellon.
I just want to, say that indeed the pesticide use did go down after the after the adoption of the herbicide-tolerant crops and after the adoption of the BT crops.
Maybe we should say what BT. I feel like nobody explained.
It's a two-trick pony. There are really only two major applications of genetic engineering. One is herbicide tolerance to one or another herbicides. The other is to put a pesticidal protein into the plants so that you don't have to use external pesticide. Although in both cases those goals are achieved only until resistance develops. Resistance has developed big time to the herbicide tolerance, to the Roundup-ready crops, so that now there is a new generation of genetically engineered crops. And in fact, most of what's in the pipeline are new herbicide-tolerant crops that will enable, in fact, require farmers to put not only glyphosate on well over 100 million acres a year, but on top of that, 2,4-D or dicamba. And that's in order to respond to this evolution of weeds, which is rampant all over the country. So and the increase of, so the 2010 report just didn't catch it. It caught the very beginning of it, but the 2014 report from ERS does catch it and does admit that this is a huge problem. So I just wanted to be clear about that. And I also, I think it's very important that I am not opposed to GE across the board, and I'm not saying that the current crops, that we know enough about them to say that they're not safe. I tend to agree that they're safe enough, probably, but that is a social definition, not a scientific definition. And I don't think that actually is the key to the issue of whether the technology could or should be embraced.
And just to be clear, you also, the two herbicides are older, less environmentally favorable
Oh, they're
herbicides.
older and way less environmentally favorable, and they are going to be used in enormous quantities. If you're an environmentalist, it's a disaster looming.
What do you think is the key to whether the technology should be embraced, though? If it's not environmental and
whether-
health safety, what is
Well,
that?
it's whether it performs, and it does not perform anywhere near what a combination of agroecology and classical breeding will have done. All of the genetically engineered crops, their yields have gone up since, the yields have gone up in those crops since the mid-90s, but not because of the GE traits, because of the conventional breeding that these companies do.
So if there were crops, like if this oranges, for example, if that worked, if there were crops that sort of measured
As long as
up
it's
to
Yeah,
what
if
you're-
it worked, but I've been told, I mean, I've heard
Okay.
the story about
Yeah.
how we're, oh, don't worry about this, that, or the other. We'll have a new protein in addition to the BT proteins to stave off resistance. We're going to cure this, we're going to cure that. I'm just skeptical. When they come up with it, then we'll take another look at it. And I'm not saying across the board that you couldn't do it, but I'm also not willing to say that people have tried all of what they could try in terms of classical breeding and
We're gonna,
Yeah, and
we'll get more into that in a second, but
Yeah, I just want to also say, I don't think the public has misunderstood this technology at all. Let's look at the facts. Soybeans, 93% of the U.S. acreage is engineered. It's all herbicide tolerant. It's all glyphosate tolerant. Canola, 90%, all herbicide tolerant. Corn, 88%. Of that, 82% is herbicide tolerant, virtually all glyphosate resistance. Cotton, about 90% engineered. Again, 82% is herbicide tolerant. Sugar beets, 90 to 95% engineered, all herbicide tolerant, all glyphosate tolerant. 25 years ago, I'm an evolutionary biologist by training. We pointed out, if you do this, the plants are going to evolve resistance, and we were told, no, glyphosate is a modified plant hormone. Plants can't evolve resistance to it. That's what they told us. We said you were crazy, and now there are 28 globally, 28 weeds are resistant to glyphosate. We have 14 of them in the United States, over 60 million acres. Farmer surveys show in 2012, 49% of all farms have at least one on them. I'll mention palm or pigweed, which is a problem in the South. There's over 100,000 acres in cotton right now that's infested with palm or pigweed. It's resistant to all herbicides, including glyphosate, so they're having to use machetes to harvest it. This technology has been about making much larger markets for herbicides. 13 of the 20 crops that are in the pipeline at USDA, they're all, glyphosate's now resistant. We have a lot more, so we're now moving to 2,4-D and dicamba. 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T is what Agent Orange was. As for glyphosate being a benign, no, it's not. Dr. Leonard Hardell, he was the Swedish epidemiologist who was the first one to show that dioxins were carcinogenic with his work in Swedish woodworkers. 2010, he published, they looked in Sweden, 904 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma cases, basically 4 hospitals in Sweden, 4 years worth of data, 1,000 controls. Glyphosate, actually, 2,4-D, which is a chlorophenoxy, is associated with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So is glyphosate. So he's actually shown that. There's also some evidence that it could be causing birth defects, as Andres Carrasco's data from Argentina. There was actually some rabbit studies from the 90s. So this notion that glyphosate's benign is actually not correct. We also recently have discovered that it's an endocrine disrupting compound. So this technology has been really about expanding markets. And these talks about these other crops, the good things they'll do, they really haven't materialized yet.
the market's going to be our next question, but Dr. Enright, I'm pretty sure you're going to want to respond to that.
Just a couple of points. Thanks very much, Dave. Again, I think that the point that Amy made earlier is that the views that Margaret and Michael are sharing are are dissenting views, right? Global scientific community would not agree with what they're saying. But I wanted to just talk about resistance for a second. For us, it's not a GMO or a genetic engineering problem, it's an agriculture problem. We have in the United States about 215 weed species that are resistant to one or more herbicides. We've been using herbicides for coming up on 70 years now. With glyphosate, it's not surprising that the more you use one tool, the more resistance you're going to get. And as Michael just said, of those 215 weed species in the United States that are resistant to Roundup, 14 of them are resistant to herbicide, 14 of them are resistant to Roundup. So we don't sit back. What we need to do is employ good agricultural practices, from the seed developers to the farmers, all across the country and all across the world. What do? You respect your rotation. You don't plant corn after corn after corn. You've got to rotate your crops. But you also have to rotate your tools. And that's why the companies that I represent, I work for, are working on new herbicide-tolerant crops, right? Again, is that going to be the answer? Absolutely not. We're trying to stay ahead of, forestall the onset of resistance. Just like in human health or animal health with antibiotics, right? We have resistance all over the place. And no one says, well, let's just stop making antibiotics. People would die. Animals and people would suffer. So what do? You try to stay ahead of the resistance. New ways, proper use. Take your 10 days, right, of antibiotics. The doctor says you have to come in now. When I was little, you could just call in and say, I have an earache. My mother would say that, and the doctor would write a script, whether I had a bacterial infection or not. Those days are gone. I think like pharmaceuticals and healthcare, agriculture gets it. We have to incorporate new tools. We have to use them wisely. But to throw a baby out with the bathwater, one might say, and say, forget it, no more GM, we don't think that that's the right path.
Can I just say one thing,
Yeah.
one very basic thing that I maybe very naively, I grew up in New York City, so I knew nothing about agriculture when I started writing about this stuff. And I heard all these stories about the increased use of herbicides and pesticides. And one just basic thing I learned is that, farmers used herbicides. Farmers want to kill weeds. That's what they want to do. They don't want weeds in their fields. So they were using herbicides well before the introduction of any GMOs. And if they didn't have GMOs, they would still use herbicides. They would use them in different combinations and in different ways. They use less pesticides now because of the type of
But they don't.
the type
Not
of
anymore.
They don't. They use
there's
more.
resistance. The resistance issue is a huge issue. But to make this final point, I think a lot of the things that come up about GMOs are problems with agriculture. Like, we all would like to see a more, a maybe less industrial or more humane or more, make sure that our agriculture system is working better. And maybe we would like to see fewer pesticides being used. But I don't, none of the evidence that I have seen or that the scientists that I've interviewed have concluded it's not a GMO problem. It's an agriculture system problem. And so I feel like it's an easy way to sort of say, well, we can just get rid of GMOs and that will solve our and it's a little too easy. So that's all.
Well, since we're not going to agree on this subject, I think let's go to something more pointed that maybe is a focus. Dr. Mellon, you argue one of your prime arguments is that it's two-trick pony, as you say, that it doesn't really work. Wouldn't that be, if that was actually true and it wasn't going to work, wouldn't that be a self-limiting problem? In other words, if farmers don't think that this stuff works, wouldn't they then not buy it and not use it, and wouldn't GMOs self-limit themselves into non-existence? Is the argument really an argument against free market economy?
It does. First of all, I'm looking at this from the public interest point of view, looking at the promised public interest benefits that were used to sell the technology early on. And then it wasn't. They were selling the technology as the answer. Right now, it is true that a lot of farmers, particularly big industrial farmers, bought the glyphosate-tolerant seeds because in the early days, it reduced their need for glyphosate, and it also reduced their costs. So they weren't thinking about public benefits. They got immediate economic benefits. But at the same time, they are in a constrained system where they only have certain choices. Now, I am all for trying to do something like crop rotation, but that people say that as if it's something that farmers could do tomorrow. Our entire subsidy agricultural system enforces on farmers choices that make it very difficult to rotate crops. If you look at what we pay for production. We have $93 million of corn because people get subsidized to grow corn. They get subsidized to grow the other big commodity crops. They will never turn to rotation until we pay them not to grow corn, until our whole subsidy system is geared toward enabling people to grow a variety of crops and to rotate them. What we need is to see the folks, everybody who's interested in agriculture, and we should take it on as a whole. It's not these little tiny pieces, but we need them to be out there to make it possible for farmers to make the right choices. Right now, they have very, very few choices. They can't even really choose to not use GE crops in a lot of cases because the companies have bought up the entire seed industry and make very little seed available that doesn't contain the traits.
Before I let it go on, let's just go back to this aspect of the question, which is none of these seem to be specifically GE-related issues. These seem to be, in general, socioeconomic and corporate issues and not GE issues.
Even resistance. I mean, even there definitely is resistance to the herbicides now. There are weeds that are not killed by these herbicides, but again, farmers were using herbicides before, and there was resistance to them before. So it's not specifically. It is a problem because farmers can't kill their weeds this way, but it's not specifically a problem of the technology.
Yes, it is, because the technology enables the herbicides and the pesticides to be used, and farmers' choices are constrained. Wait a minute, farmers' choices are constrained because they have bought up the seed companies. Because we allow patents on living things, that has led to the seed companies. So now the top 3 seed companies are Monsanto, DuPont, and Syngenta. They now control globally 53% of the global seed trade. All right? The top 6 seed companies, which are all biotech companies, they own 76%. That constrains what farmers can plant. So, for example, soybeans. Monsanto developed a divisive soybean. It has high oleic acid. That means you can make a non-trans fat oil out of that. Well, since we know nobody wants trans fats because they know that they're bad, if you're a farmer, of course you want to buy a trans fat-free, a soybean that gives you trans fat-free oil. That was developed via conventional breeding. But you know what? You can only buy it in a Roundup Ready variety. Just like when they re-registered a lot of the BT varieties, you had farmers from the Midwest complaining to the EPA, I don't have a problem with European corn borer on my acreage, but if I want to get the best genetics for my area, I have to use the engineered one. And that's because the biotech companies, when they buy up the seed companies, they can determine what seeds will be put on the market.
But I think that speaks exactly to...
And that is a biotech issue because it was in this country, which we pushed on the rest of the world, that we can now say that living organisms are able to be patented like a machine.
So
that utility patent
let's change
was
the
never...
patent system, though. I don't see why it's a tech. I don't see how that is about genetic engineering. I see that. I agree. Like we shouldn't have so much ownership of
But that is about genetic
No,
engineering.
but what does it mean when I don't know, a high-level Monsanto official says, in order for us to feed the next 2 billion people that we anticipate coming before the population tops off, we have to have genetic engineering.
That's not true.
Now, but I mean, what does that mean? Can we assess that statement without knowing how the technology's been used? Shall we say, I mean, what is the right answer to that? It seems to me that he wants to separate the technology and make it especially an essential ingredient to solving a world's big problem, I don't think he can do that.
So
mean,
may I just
Yeah,
answer
yeah.
that? So I just want to set the record straight. Again, I speak for the
Yeah.
industry. We never said that. What we did say is that right now, we understand that in a given year, we need to make multi-year yield gains to be prepared to feed the world in 2050. Right now, for us, genetic engineering is the best technique we have, but we have to keep all tools in the toolbox. We need organic, we need conventional, we need genetic engineering, we need whatever technologies are coming down the pike available to us, because shame on us if as the years get closer to 2050 and there's 9 billion mouths, we didn't do what we needed to do and ensure that we could supply for the world
But there-
enough yields.
But
Shame
there
on us
isn't
if
a
we don't
single
keep the
product
access.
out there that has demonstrated an increase in intrinsic yield, except for classical breeding. That's what really ought to be the focus of our resources. If we want more tools in the toolbox, let's
Agreed.
put a big chunk of money behind classical breeding, which often gets overlooked.
I'd agree with, Margaret, I completely agree with you. Let's put money. We have to make sure we've got access to everything as we move forward.
Do you have a problem with private companies spending money as they see fit to do research,
To do research,
to develop new varieties, or to do what they want?
I think, I don't have a problem with private companies doing, doing a lot. I think that they ought to operate in a really, in a free market economy, which would mean a completely different patent system and would restrain some of their market power. Really, another part of our agricultural policy is that it should be a public-private mix. And one of the things we've let happen is that we have given all of our research over to the private sector rather than retaining and funding a really viable public sector that both breeds and distributes seeds.
Yeah, and I'd also just point out that globally, just like there was this international panel on climate change, there was actually a global look at agriculture. It's called the IAASCD, the International Agricultural Assessment of the Role of Science and Technology for Development. And again, it was 400 scientists. It was a huge global thing. The U.S. and the industry walked away at the end of the process. Why? Because they didn't like what they said. Because that report came out and said the answer for the future is not technology, it's not genetic engineering, it's not nanotech technology, it's these agroecological approaches and taking more local approaches, which have been shown to be very useful. So there has been a global agreement on this. And in fact, if you look what FAO is doing with their new food security program, they're functionally saying the same thing. I can show you UNEP reports for Africa and for East Asia, for Eastern Europe, that talk about the way forward there is for this sustainable agriculture, not genetic engineering, not any of these higher technologies which haven't turned out to work. I have no problems with companies spending their money on any research they want. But if they're going to bring a product onto the market, there should be required safety assessments, and it should be labeled once it comes out here. Because this notion that there's no difference and there's no safety issue, excuse me, the world agreed that these were different enough and they should go through a safety assessment. You don't do that unless you admit there could be a safety problem. So when people try to say Europe says none of these crops are a problem, or WHO says that, that's not what they say. We were very involved in the whole global process. Consumers Union is part of Consumers International. We have 220 member organizations in 115 countries, and we were very active. I've been an international expert on this issue, advising this whole process. So there is a difference, and to try to say there's no scientific debate about the safety, that is just false. There are a lot of scientists around the world that are concerned with this, and that see that the U.S. does not require safety assessments. If this technology is so safe, fine, do all the safety tests, and let's see the data.
Well, two-part question based on that, which we'll toss off then afterwards to Dr. Enright. First of all, GMO is such a broad spectrum of possible things that could be there. Are just labeling a product GMO without addressing other possible hazards like nanotechnology, which could prove to be even bigger hazard in the future, if you believe there's a hazard to GMOs. Putting such a stamp, is that really misleading and fear-mongering? And secondly, the second prong of that question is, as far as I can tell, safety testing in the United States is voluntary in name only, and in fact actually happens all the time. What are your thoughts on that? And then when I toss it over to you, why not just have the industry say, hey, let's make it mandatory? If it's really mandatory in real life, why not just say it's mandatory so people feel better about it?
All right, very quickly about labels being fear mongering. No, they're not. That's just factual information. And I should point out, this was the same argument that the industry used when nutrition labels were required. When people were wanting the amount of sugars, saturated fats, and all that to be put on the label, industry was saying, no, we can't do that. That's fear mongering. It'll drive people way. So to say a factual information, whether something's been engineered or not, is a black mark. Again, that's just wrong. It's a piece of information. As for safety testing just being voluntary and a name only, that's actually, it has to be required because the FDA doesn't make any conclusions. There's this kabuki process of these voluntary safety consultations, and the companies get a letter at the end where the FDA says, and I'll quote from one of them because this line is in all the letters, and this was for Mon 810, Monsanto's first BT corn variety, and that sentence reads, quote, this is the FDA speaking, it is our understanding that Monsanto has concluded that Mon 810 does not differ in composition, utility, or use from corn, grain, and forage currently on the market and does not require issues that would require pre-market review by the FDA. So, that does not happen. The FDA does not make any assumptions. They just say they assume the companies think they're safe. I could go into many details about the reason you want to require safety assessments is because then you can dictate what kinds of tests get done and how they get done. Because you can design tests not to find anything by using small sample sizes, by not using near isolines, and this was very debated out at Codex. If people want to go into detail, I can go into huge amounts of detail about the kind of safety assessments and sequence information that should be required. The U.S. cannot meet any of that, and their top government officials have admitted as much at these international meetings when we're behind closed doors. So this notion that the U.S., they're all perfectly safe is just wrong. There's less safety assessment for these crops than there are for additives or coloring agents. If the data were all there, then the industry would just say, fine, we'll meet this standard. We've already done all the studies. Here they are. They don't do that.
Well, let's see what the industry has to say about it.
So from the industry's perspective on labeling, we support the right to know. We support people having information about how their food is grown. Our seed bags are labeled. The farmer knows exactly what he or she is buying. We would agree with the question, Dave, that you asked, is that if you were to require a label of GMO or something like that on a package to us, right, and it's our opinion, that would convey to consumers that there's something less than about that product, less nutritious, less healthy, less safe, and that's food that is made from our farmers' customers' crops, and we just can't abide that message. But I repeat, the goal would be, I think the success would be for us to sit down and find a mechanism that gets the information out without a prejudice, that just, again, lets the facts be known. We've been really clear about this. With regard to safety testing, it's funny that you should say, Michael, about the testing and the data. Actually, we support disclosure of the data, and we support mandatory review by FDA. The Congress hasn't achieved either of those yet, but we support them both.
I got one that I think hopefully you guys will have some responses on. So this is a rather pointed one. We'll see what you think, Dr. Enright. The current feelings that most of us who are or not pro-GMO about the safety, the current ones, are based on traits that have been introduced that are relatively ecologically benign, relatively, as compared to, let's say, genetically modifying salmon to change its complete growth cycle, which seems much less ecologically benign, potentially. What are your thoughts on that? Is there a false sense of safety based on what has been chosen to be added so far?
Yeah, the fish is a great example. So the idea behind the faster growing salmon was to be able to, in contained pens in aquaculture, inland, provide cheap sources of good protein. That is the goal. I think you've probably all heard about you've probably seen the stories in the press and online across social media at it, but that really is the goal. So the idea is, as I said, talk about sustainable need, for protein, for providing the world with cheap protein. Right. I was on a panel one time, this was 2 years ago, where an economist said, we were talking about yields and the need to feed people and the need to be able to produce protein right next door as opposed to fishing out the seas. And he kind of patted me figuratively on the head. And he said, the rainforest is coming down. And I don't want to hear that. And the folks in the audience were saying, we object to that. We reject what you just said. He goes, you can reject all you want, people with your emotions, right? You with your technology. Said, if we don't get it, he said, we're not going to get a handle on this because we're having this conversation right here. Instead of focusing on getting people food and using less land and less resources, and he said, the rainforest is coming down. And food will go up because there's no infrastructure in there right now for railways and such. And so it's interesting how, while I didn't like his message, I didn't want to hear him being so absolute about what we humans would do in the next 40 years, I think part of the conversation we're having about GM, it kind of diverts us from ag policy, sustainability, subsidies, patents, right? If GMOs went away today, we'd still have patents on plants. We've been patenting plants for 80 years. So the traditional breeding technologies that Margaret's talking about, the folks who develop those are going to patent them. So again, I agree with Amy. I agree with Amy. I think that part of the conversation, again, we're at fault. We have not talked about this in 20 years, right? Part of this conversation is almost it's kind of diverting our attention from the chronic issues that are touched upon in each one of the points that we made.
I think each genetically engineered crop, whether it's or fish or soybeans or anything, needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis for its sort of social value and relative risk versus, but I like to, we think about the risks, but there is a risk of inaction too. So my only, I feel like I come off as this big, sounding like this big defender of genetic engineering. It's more that I really think it's a technology that has to be considered as one option, and to reject it out of hand because of certain uses doesn't make sense, and really could put us at risk. I wanted to also just respond to the idea of the sort of the global aspect of it, because I don't think it's true that that yield. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but there's genetically engineered cotton is a huge crop. It's not a food crop, but in India and elsewhere, it has really and this is called BT. This modification that allows the crop to resist insects, so that pesticides don't have to be used on the insects. Has been widely adopted, as Michael noted, and has really reduced the use of pesticide and reduced the use of farmers having to use these pesticides, and it has increased the yield in developing world countries. And I also did a story about a kind of rice called golden rice, which is under development and hasn't been introduced yet, but it's because most of the world's poor eats rice, and rice does not have the ability to produce beta-carotene, which is the precursor to vitamin A. Vitamin A deficiency causes childhood blindness. It causes all kinds of diseases because it weakens the immune system. It causes, millions of deaths among people in the developing world. So, and it can't produce this protein. No, you can't breed various kinds of rice together in traditional breeding to make it produce beta-carotene. So scientists have taken beta-carotene from corn and put it into the DNA that produces beta-carotene in corn and in a bacteria, and put it in the rice to allow it to produce beta-carotene. it's still in development. It's been in development for a long time, and it takes a lot of knocks because it hasn't come to fruition yet. But why would you want to not let that be tested? I mean, if it could produce beta-carotene and allow people to have this vitamin A.
I don't know which one of you wants to take that first.
Actually, since I've done a lot of work on vitamin A rice, in fact, doing a lot of teach-ins with farmer organizations in many of the Asian countries, it really is a chimera because the vitamin A that they talk about in 2000 and 2005, those crops are a form of rice that's not eaten by most of the poor. They're basically a form of rice such as eaten in Japan. They haven't been able to get the technology to actually work in the so-called indica varieties of rices. Those are the paddy rices that are what the poor
But it's
actually...
being tested in those types of rices.
it
in
is
the
being
Philippines
tested, but we
now.
still have not seen a shred of data on any of those. And I would just point out that globally, it's considered if more than 20% of the vulnerable population, that's children 5 and under and pregnant and lactating women, if more than 20% of that population is vitamin A deficient, it's considered of serious public health significance. In the Philippines, which is right where this is tested, in 2000, that level was 40% for children 5 and under, and 25% and 22% for pregnant and lactating women. In the 10 years since then, or the 14 years, what have we seen? Golden rice is still nowhere. They've pulled millions of dollars into it with existing vitamin A supplementation and food fortification programs. When I was there, Jollibee's, which is sort of like our KFC, had ads for their new chicken tenders with bits of carrots and vitamin A added. And guess what? The Philippine data now show by 2008, that figure of 40%, it's now in children 5 and under, it's 15.2%. 15% is considered the cutoff of public health significance. For pregnant and lactating women, no longer 25 and 22%, that's now down at 6% and 9%. So basically in the Philippines, they don't really have a vitamin
so we
A
should just let those
deficiency
15% people
problem
not
in the
have
Philippines,
vitamin A?
right? So that's in the Philippines, and I would point out that the basic problem is one of poverty. It's because they can't feed other things. So this notion of if we increase more production, people will be fed more is false. Anywhere where people are starving or malnourished, even in the United States, it's a political issue and it's a distributional issue.
Of course,
it's not
it's a
production
bigger issue. But why would you want to deny them this particular
I'm not
tool?
denying
I
it.
would rather solve poverty. Yes,
No.
that would be better.
We're
But
not
why would
denying
you-
it. I think it's great, as I've told
But
the
you're-
Erie
but
folks,
you're saying that it
let's
shouldn't
see
be-
the data. I have no
So
problem.
you have no
Let's-
problem with it being tested, and you're for
I am
golden rice.
definitely
Sure.
for it
Okay.
being tested. but
Absolutely. I'd love to see the data.
But I am concerned about the use of the golden rice in particular as something that's aimed, it isn't as if someone asked, what are the 10 best things we can do to address vitamin A deficiencies in the developing world, and this was at the top of the list. It would not be. There are much easier, cheaper ways of doing it that at least ought to have been considered. What it is a way of talking to people like Europe who have decided that they can do without GE, and they're doing quite well.
I don't know that there are. I mean, I have looked
no.
somewhat at all of the different ways, and the supplementation that Michael refers to is costly. That costs the government to put the supplements in this
Well,
food.
and it is
and
the case.
growing
They haven't
vegetables would be
shown
great,
that-
but teaching people how to grow vegetables and giving them the time and the resources to do that is also really hard.
But
So
it doesn't really help you to eat the rice unless you have an otherwise adequate diet, unless you have a lot of.
And you have to make sure that if
So reading it to very poor people won't work at all.
Well, plus, if the rice sits for a month or two, the beta-carotene levels can decline over time. That's the real issue, because all the 2 feeding studies that have been done, that's with rice that is exactly as soon as it's harvested, they put it at minus 60 degrees centigrade until they do the feeding study.
so-
That's not how it's used in Asia. Gather the rice, let it sit for a month or two, and let's look at what the levels are there. Some of the critics of us, we have been saying this for 9 or 10 years. There is still not a single study about what the levels are in the rice after it sits for a month or 2 months. This has
I
been
think
going
that's
on
These
for
are,
40
hold on a
years.
second. These are just let me see if I can get us to agree here. This is just argument that they're incompetent, right? So the question is,
Well,
it
it's
seems
just-
it
it's
seems
just
to me
taking a
that
long
if they could get
time.
it to
It's
work,
hard.
if they could get it to work, right? And it was license-free so that they could use it and save the seed, and it was just another thing, part of the pot. You're not against it.
I am
No, not
certainly
at all.
not against it.
It kind of sounds like you are, but I'm
No,
just
but
like,
I
it's-
am
No,
against.
go
but
through the
no, but
proper
I
safety
do-
assessment.
It is very important, I think, that it is pitched primarily at people who already have plenty of food, like those in Europe who are otherwise unwilling to accept the technology. And it's part of a larger argument that, well, Europe, may not need herbicide-tolerant plants or BT crops, but you cannot afford to reject it, because if you do, then somebody in the Philippines will not be able to eat. And that connection is one that I think is troubling, very troubling. As I said, I'd like to see a lot of resources go into what we could do to help the poor feed themselves, rather than just, we have to have genetic engineering as a solution. Otherwise, there's no other way that we
I
can solve
just
their
don't see them as
problems.
mutually exclusive. I
Right.
mean,
Well,
I agree with you.
yeah.
There should be more.
And-
I don't know who, Margaret, is saying that, but it's not the industry. Our industry doesn't believe that. We have investment and scientific investigation all across the board. We think everything needs to be available. And if I may just point out on Europe, you're right. In Europe, strong labeling law, you can find, probably the last thing I saw in Europe that was labeled GM was Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. But Europe's agricultural productivity is not kept up. And Europe can no longer afford to feed its livestock by itself. So it imports about 72% of its livestock feed. And where does it import it from? The United States, Brazil, and Argentina. The livestock feed is all genetically engineered. But
It's
that doesn't
all
have to be
soybeans.
labeled. But that does not have to be labeled. So while it looks as though Europe is GE free, and the technology is, there's no public acceptance there, as we know. But the fact is, they're not living truly a GM or a GMO-free lifestyle, because their animals are eating it every day.
All right, the last question before we open up to the audience, in from Twitter, from Wayne Serber, and I'll throw this one to Dr. Hansen first. If we were to nationalize GMO labeling and regulation, how will we pay for it, and who will enforce it?
What do you mean, how will we pay for it? It's just another piece of information that needs to be on the label. We could do it as under ingredient labeling.
Presumably verification, I think, is what he's talking about. Verification and the testing would be part of the cost. Presuming, it's not my question,
No, you don't necessarily need that. You can just have a paper trail. We do this all the time. When the studies that have been done in Europe have found that that when the labeling came in, there were predictions of double-digit increases, increases in the price of food, and none of that has happened. So the evidence of how much it would cost is actually very little, because it's just like another ingredient. So it's
So-
something very, farmers all know what they're buying. It would just be another thing that you'd have to put on the label.
But Michael, it's not just another thing. When it's mandatory, then it has to be verified. It can be verified. So what one would talk about, just like on nutrition labeling, right? You see amount of carbohydrates and calories and all that. It has to be precise. You can't say it is when it isn't. It's against the law. You can't say it is when it isn't. If you were to require, and we may end up that way, right? Let's see how the public policy debate goes. If food requiring derived from or containing genetically modified ingredients was forced to be labeled, you would have to track it, just as one does, for example, with organic, right? The organic, if you have USDA certified organic, right? It's a voluntary label, it's a marketing label, has nothing to do with safety or nutrition. But the fact is, in order to use that label, you have to track and identity preserve the food through the system. That's one of the reasons certified organic costs a little more than conventional food.
Country of origin labeling hasn't really increased prices, and that you have to track too, because there's no simple test you can do on a food to tell what country it came from.
Well, is there a difference between ongoing testing requirements for something that could have cross-field contamination or different supplier inputs versus a nutritional labeling where the recipe changes, then you get new
Well,
nutritional
no,
information?
actually, for the labeling laws that are moving through the states, or that, for example, just got voted through in Vermont earlier this week, those would actually exempt, you're talking about the genetic contamination issues. Those would actually be exempted. If a farmer's planting something that they buy as conventional, that is non-engineered, and they buy that in good faith, if it happens to be contaminated, they're exempt from that. And actually, it was First the Seed, a UCS publication over 10 years ago, looked and found that there's actually low-level contamination of conventional seed. So none of this, that kind of cross-contamination, no, wouldn't require labeling. It's the knowing intentional use. So that could be a big problem. I do think contamination is an issue. That's why there's been all these global disruptions in trade, because the supposed technology, which is all safe, it keeps on getting out and contaminating food products, and even getting out of small test plots and ending up contaminating half our rice supply in the case of LL601, or the Monsanto Roundup Ready wheat that was stop tested in 2004 and then showed up in a farmer's field in Oregon last year and wreaked havoc for a few months with exports to wheat exports to Japan and Korea.
I mean, my feeling about labeling is that my problem with it is the idea of a blanket GMO label. So even here today, we've talked about, I think I can count 4 types of GMOs. And so there's GMOs that there's genetic engineering, which produces crops that are tolerant to herbicides. There's genetic engineering that produces crops that are resistant to insects, which actually lowers the use of pesticides, typically. There's a GMO that resists diseases. And actually, so I've talked about the orange. I'm just going to say the orange doesn't exist yet. That was sort of it's an ongoing research project. But there is a papaya, the Hawaiian papaya, since I spent some time reporting in Hawaii this year, that crop, the Hawaiian papaya crop, was going to be wiped out by a virus. And now a genetically engineered papaya grows there that is resistant to the virus. So it did reduce pesticide. It was also spread by an insect, so they were spraying. They reduced their spraying, and it is sold. And so there's that kind of GMO. There's potentially the kind of GMO that increases the nutritional value of food if something like golden rice were to work out, or there's what is it, the omega-3 soy, there's soybeans that have higher omega-3. So what does it tell you to know that this is a GMO? And each of those are done with a different type of modification. So the corn is modified with a bacteria, the soybeans are modified with a different kind of bacteria, the rice is modified with a corn DNA, and the orange might be modified with spinach DNA. Unless you think that there's something intrinsically dangerous about moving DNA from one organism to another, which scientific consensus says there isn't, then I don't see what the GMO label tells you.
But I think, Amy, I think the mistake for our industry and the food supply is to ignore the desire for information. And so that's what I said. We support the right to know. The label that we are talking about is, as Amy has said, it's just flawed. It's, in our opinion, meant to bias consumers to not purchase that product. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't get in a room and figure out a way to provide folks the information they're seeking.
And I would just say, again, since in other countries, there's required safety assessments before these products are allowed on the market. That does not happen with crops that come out of conventional breeding. So to say that others have not recognized that genetic engineering could raise safety issues is just wrong, because again, there's global agreement that they're different, and there should be
I'm all for
required
testing.
safety assessments.
Testing is good. We should test.
So that
Yeah.
should be.
Dr. Mellon, I want to give you a
That should be
chance before we go to Q&A to take a bite at this apple.
Well, I mean, I think lots of people want to know whether or not their food is genetically engineered, and that a good faith attempt should be made to provide people with that information. I agree with Amy that you can't provide sufficiently detailed arguments or information about cost and benefits for each product, but we could think about ways of providing that additional layer of information to any folks who wanted it. But I think there is a group of folks who simply who just want to know whether it's genetically engineered or not, and they will take their own, they'll use that information as they want. Some of them may want this more detailed information. Some people may just decide there may be risks associated with it, and frankly, the benefits, there are not benefits. They're enough for me, so I'm just going to tend to walk away from it. But we make those kinds of broad generalizations about our food all the time, and I think we ought to be able to do it here.
I can't help myself. One follow-up to what you're saying. Does it matter to you at all, the reasons why people want to know? In other words, does it bother you when people make decisions that aren't based in any sort of rational thought? Or is it, in other words, like, does it matter what the reason is, why they don't want it?
Well, it really, except at the extreme, it doesn't. I mean, it bothers me when people say, well, I have to eat I have genetically engineered food if we're going to be able to feed the world. That is not grounded in science or reason. It's the kind of thing I would rather not see people do. But except at the very margin, I think I think food is just so complicated. It has so many cultural flavor. People care about how it was raised. They care what the farmers were like. I certainly would not, want to divide the good arguments into the bad ones.
And I would just like to quickly say on that it's up to consumers to make their own decision, whether it's a, quote, rational or unrational decision. I would point out the industry tries to say that the only reason we label are for health and safety. That's not true. Look for labeling of hydrolyzed proteins. They require that source labeling. Why? Because if a can of corn has a hydrolyzed protein that comes from an animal, a vegetarian is going to want to know that. Or if that protein comes from a pig, a kosher Jew or a halal Muslim is going to want to know that. Is there any scientific reason why they should know that? No. It's because for their religious or cultural, because they're vegetarian. That it's not my right to tell people that's not a rational decision for you to know something. And that's how what should be on the labels is information that is material, that is of importance to consumers. And I don't think we should condescend to them and say, your reason for wanting this, it's not scientific, so therefore you shouldn't have it. I'm an agnostic, right? So I don't necessarily buy into any religion. Am I going to deny a kosher Jew or a halal Muslim to have that information on source, on hydrolyzed proteins? Absolutely, because that's something that is of importance to that population. And they have their own reasons for knowing that, and it's not our place to say this is scientific and this is not, and you don't have a reason to know that. People have their own reasons for why they want things labeled, and it's up to them to make that decision. If people think it's a bad label or something like that, hey, that is what marketing is about. Because just saying the factual information, that's not misleading. It's factual information. If you want to claim that it's a black label, again, that was the same argument that they used for nutrition labeling. And we had to fight for years and years to get that here.
And if the orange ever happens, which it might, and it is presented to the public, it has been reviewed under a mandatory safety review system and is labeled as genetically engineered, people will be able to make their own decision and decide whether that is an orange that they want to buy. Why shouldn't they have that decision, particularly if it's as implicitly beneficial as you might believe? That people should be proud of that label. I think it's telling that folks don't want to kind of put that
People will have no way of knowing that this orange was modified in order to resist a bacteria that otherwise would have wiped out the crop in Florida versus herbicide tolerant.
Well, that goes back to the marketing.
Of course, but
no, Amy, what I would say with that citrus greening is we can talk afterwards. There are actually a number of biological and other mechanisms that have controlled citrus greening in, for example, Taiwan with the use of the parasitic wasps, the Réunion Islands.
They tried that in Florida. It didn't work.
No, you're right.
did
There
try it.
has been some releases of those parasitic wasps, but they don't know whether they were the right genotype or not. You could talk to Marjorie Hoy about that, since she's done some of those releases.
Well-
There's also a fungi. There's also breeding.
Well, we're going to get into like another 5-hour debate if we say that introducing species that belong somewhere else into a new environment is more or less safe than genetic engineering.
No. But,
Which I don't wanna
but
do.
wait a minute. No. Part
But,
of the issue with genetic engineering is the FDA sort of recognizes that it is different, because in 2001, they did this pre-market biotech notification policy. And when you read that carefully, you'll see that they recognize that there's a difference between genetic engineering and conventional breeding, and it's what they call insertional mutagenesis. They have no control where they're inserting things. And therefore, they said that's why they would want data on each separate transformation event.
All right.
Data, but they're not operating under that policy. They're still operating under the 92 policy.
We'll also have to have another debate at some point about what substantially equivalent means and all these other things. But right now, I'd like to have the audience be able to ask some questions, so let's do it. Emma, I'm going to have you choose the peoples. I don't want to be the meanie.
So who we got here? Evelyn?
Yeah. My concern about the GMO debate is, and this is particularly pointing towards Amy and, to Amy and Dr. Embright, is that I feel that both Monsanto and with respect to the food security issues, that there's a certain degree of emotional hijacking that's been done on the behalf of Monsanto and a lot of these other issues in terms of food security. Oh, you're going to deny the right of babies to get healthy, so on and so forth. I mean, a lot of the issues that are surrounding around poverty and food security issues are not necessarily issues of tech. They're issues of logistics. There are issues of distributions. There are issues of vast amounts of food waste. India is actually a really good example of how logistics and distribution would make a vast difference in terms of its food security issues. It's not tech. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm really concerned about the kind of disingenuous argument that the food industry, especially Monsanto and company, are making in terms of trying to guilt people into thinking that GMO is the answer to food security issues when it's far more complicated.
I agree. So I would just say, I'll repeat what I said before. We don't think that the technology is the only answer. We need everything. We just happen.
Then why are you not advocating for that? Why
We
is always
are.
GMOs at the forefront?
That is,
As opposed
but
to as opposed to having distribution, other technology.
agree with you, distribution, agree with all of that. So again, my companies are invested in all. They're doing research in all. They are first, though, with regard to genetics, biotech companies, and so they're promoting their product. But I have to disagree with you. I've worked for this industry for a number of years. I don't know what was said 20, 25 years ago. Those things are not being said today.
Giving to poverty reduction.
Oh my gosh. Oh, they are. Ma'am, I'll give you my card, and I will, Monsanto. So they're a company in the United States, so yes, they do want to make money and provide return investment to their shareholders, absolutely. Their first customer is the farmer. They will they will produce what the farmer wants, at first and foremost. If we somehow...
The farmer has no choice, then what kind of market are you giving?
But the farmer does has it. What you've heard is not it is not accurate.
I think you guys should certainly
I
discuss
think,
afterward
this
and
is the- it was-
exchange
Get
email
like a
addresses,
yellow ring.
I would
exchange
just,
cards.
ma'am, I thank you for your question. I think that, I hope what I've conveyed today is that we're not as far apart as perhaps folks thought we were when we walked in. There's information that you don't have, and so I'm happy to put you in touch with folks at Monsanto. They'd be happy to talk with you if you want to talk with them, and if their information isn't what you wanted to hear or needed to hear, you let me know.
Well, let me just
Thank you.
pose a follow-up. there seems to be like a kind of a spackle of wanting to do good things over the surface of what is in general, this is the perception, over what is in general a money-making business, as you say.
Yeah.
The real question, I think, was not going to necessarily ever going to agree, is it inherently evil for someone who controls a big chunk of the world's food supply to be making decisions solely based on monetary concerns? And are we really having a discussion about the problem of a free market economy? Is that really what we're talking about here?
I mean, I think that, you know, a lot of people's fear of GMOs comes from this issue, right? That you're afraid that multinational corporations are controlling the food supply. And I think that suspicion is well placed, right? We should be worried about multinational corporations controlling the food supply. You should be suspicious. Every company, you know, including, you know, Apple, who everybody loves their iPhones, but Apple is also, they're out to make money. They're not out to, for the public interest. They care about their bottom line above the public interest. So, I mean, my feeling about genetic engineering is also, but to me, that doesn't mean like, oh, well, genetic engineering is obviously bad since these multinational corporations are doing it. I think it's more of a concern of, well, here is this potentially really useful technology that could help us grow food more efficiently at a time when we urgently need to do that. So if we don't want to put it all in the hands of private corporations, maybe we actually should, now this is different from what you're saying, Margaret, but maybe more public money should be spent on it. Maybe the public should have more control of this technology. Just to sort of flip your question on it.
We can all agree
All
with
right,
that.
let's
All
move
right,
on to new
let's do
question.
next question.
This is for Dr. Enright. First of all, I just want to call you out on the analogy that you made earlier when you were talking about antibiotics and you were comparing that to GMOs. People won't die if we stop growing GMOs. And I just think that was a really deceptive analogy that you were making. But I do have a question for you. When you came out here, I actually wrote the sentence down. You started off by saying that you want to get the facts in front of folks and let them make up their own minds. And yet you've argued that you don't like the concept of the labels that are in the state laws that are out there. Yet I don't know that most people in this room know this, but I believe it was 1994, 1995, Monsanto ran a couple of ads in the UK that acknowledged that their products were genetically engineered. They said, we're proud of, I think if you Google it, you can find them online, Monsanto GMO ads, 1994, UK. And it's this whole thing, we're proud of our product and we think people should know. What changed? Why don't we have those, why isn't Monsanto running ads like that anymore? You want to get the information out there.
So if I didn't mean to make a health analogy between antibiotics and antibiotic resistance and disease or herbicide tolerant resistant. That was a scientific analogy I was making. So I'm sorry if I was inartful in that way. Just resistance will happen, right? You put a pressure on any organism and it will evolve, right? So that was the analogy, so I'm sorry if I misled you in any way. We're absolutely proud. Again, I'm repeating myself. I think if we're for getting the information to consumers, we produce seeds, right? We don't produce the food, but we support a consumer right to know, and we support getting the information out. Why are we not working on a mechanism that works for us all?
Yeah, we have time for maybe only one or two
But
more since
you
we've gone so
agree,
far
didn't
over.
you say earlier that you believe that marketing information and transparency so far has been disastrous from an industry standpoint, right?
Absolutely.
All right, so one or two more. Let's get one from the way back.
I keep hearing you just focus on that you're producing seeds without focusing on that you also produce the pesticides that go with the seeds. Also in terms of feeding the world, you really only are producing a handful of crops. And if you look at 80 to 90% of the food in America, it contains soy or corn, which I don't know about anybody else, but I just don't really want to only eat soy or corn for the rest of my life. So in terms of focusing on other products, I am wondering, in terms of when I look at the past 30 years, like the health crisis in this country, obesity, cancer, diabetes, like it just seems like I'm not a scientist, I'm just someone that observes. So I'm just seeing like what that correlation between GMOs since it was introduced and the health crisis.
So maybe I could just talk about the concern about correlation. About 3 months ago, someone sent me a graph. It was actually one of my friends she had unfriended me on Facebook because of what I do and my opinions, right? It's a free country. I was sad to lose her as a friend. But then she came across a graph that had a correlation between the increased consumption of organic and the increase in autism in the United States. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. But that's the problem with correlation, right? In the United States, what do? We eat too much. We eat too much processed food and we don't get enough exercise. We're stressed. We're overworked. I'm a mom. I'm a grandmother. I'm on a plane. Personally, myself, more often than I want, I'm getting fatter and fatter every year. I don't eat a lot of processed food. But the fact is that I think that I'm probably a typical American who is maybe your poster child for someone who eats healthy, but I'm still not there. So just the correlation issue, I just encourage folks to just think about, you can correlate anything if you want. One of my smart aleck scientist friends said the other day on correlation that, do you actually know that we've increased the longevity of Americans over the last 10 years? They've also been eating more GMOs. Again, a correlation, you can pick points and make whatever you want. So yes, we need better education. Our diets need to be healthy. We need more exercise. We need to stay off airplanes. You can avoid corn and soy if you want to because it's an ingredient on the label.
Yeah, I just actually like to follow up on that because I actually agree with Dr. Enright because there are some people that I'll say try to go too far and try to correlate, for example, the use of glyphosate with virtually every disease, whether it's thyroid cancer or all these things, and they see these nice tight correlations and they're trying to imply that there's something there, and there really isn't, because I'll just take the thyroid cancer one. It looks like it's exact. Well, but if you think about it, that's the amount of glyphosate that's used year by year. If it's tracking autism cases or in this case, thyroid cancer cases perfectly, that means that you're spraying that amount of glyphosate per year on corn and soy. You would have to harvest those crops, put them into food, people would have to eat them, and then they would have to get thyroid cancer. And you know what? A thyroid carcinogen isn't immediate. There's a number of year lag delay. So those of us that are biologists that see a lot of those correlations realize they don't really mean anything, but there are people out there that are trying to say, look, it's causing all these things. So that's one area where I do agree with you, because people have shown a correlation. There's that one with organic food and autism. There's a correlation with amount of glyphosate being used on engineered corn and soy, which looks like it's a perfect correlation as well. So there are problems with correlation and causation.
I want to agree with that.
Yep.
I think that approach to trying to see what might be the downside of genetic engineering is way off track.
And I would just say for the last 30 years, we now know that there's all sorts of compounds that are endocrine disruptors, things that BPA, all these things are added to the foods. We've had the Endocrinology Society. Those are the scientists that actually deal with hormones who basically come out and said we need to move away from these compounds. Some of them are plastics and plasticizers. Some of them are actually, pesticides. So you can't just point to one thing. I think there are some people that want to say all these disease problems in the last 30 years, it's all due to GE or it's all due to glyphosate. That's wrong too. There are issues, but some of it does go too far,
All right.
and I do
We're
agree.
out of time, but I'm going to let you guys all get last licks, but like Twitter style, like short, like 30 to 45 seconds. And I'm going to give Dr. Enright last bat because she was hammered during the questioning session. And so before we do that, I would like to thank you guys so much for being part of this panel. I hope everyone here, thank you so much for coming. What? Oh, fill out surveys. Please fill out surveys. Whatever that means, do it. Yeah, so thank you so much, and then let's get your wrap-ups.
Okay, I guess after a year of reporting on this, what became concerning to me, even sort of as in a meta way, was it was bigger than the issue of genetic engineering. It was about who. We haven't really talked about kind of the politics, but people who are kind of rejecting genetically engineered food. It tends to be centered in people who I think people like you, people who are sort of politically left, foodies, people who care a lot about agriculture and how their food is produced. Those people are not the people. You guys are not the people who typically reject scientific evidence on most issues. So if you look at climate change or stem cell research or politically left liberal people who care are the people who have traditionally supported science on these other questions. And I talk to a lot of scientists who are sort of saying to me, they feel like GMOs are the climate change denial of the left. And I hear the the hissing and the sighing, but I guess I became concerned that there was some truth to that. And I would just say that my stories are aimed at trying to get people to look at the scientific evidence and make their decisions based on it, and not just sort of reject it out of hand, because it's dangerous on a bigger level than just how we're going to grow our food, to ignore what science has learned about a particular field that it knows about.
Now I have to respond to the climate denial argument. Climate deniers deny science on a scientific question, which is whether or not climate change is happening at all. The question of whether or not we should use genetically engineered crops as a basis for our food system is not a purely scientific question. It is one that has a scientific component, but it also has a large social component because there are lots of alternatives. I would make the analogy to atomic power. There are scientific questions about nuclear power. How much will it produce? How much radiation will it produce? But the question, and those are scientific questions on which only scientists can talk. The question of whether nuclear power is a good idea is a broad societal question. Again, it has a scientific component, but scientists per se are not any better to answer that societal question than everybody in this room. So you ought to feel free, empowered, encouraged to help make your own decision between the available technologies in the toolbox in agriculture without feeling that you have all of a sudden walked into the same box with people who say evolution didn't happen and climate change isn't happening. That being said, I'd still want to say I think I am comfortable with there being eventually some percentage of crops or engineered, because there really is no better way to solve the problems that engineering's trying to solve. But I still think it's going to be, based on its track record, a trivial technology in terms of what we need going forward. We will be able to solve all the world's agricultural problems with conventional breeding, agroecology, and sophisticated kind of genomic stuff. We can do it. We absolutely, if we don't have genetic engineering, really it's not going to make any difference. It's a marginal side technology with occasionally a few uses, not essential at all.
Yeah, and I just like to say, this notion that people who question GE or climate science deniers, or I like how they call us, or anti-evolution. I have a PhD in evolutionary biology. So I just think that's nonsense. With any new technology, whether it's genetic engineering, whether it's nanotechnology, which I work on, or synthetic biology, these new technologies need to be required to be assessed before they're allowed on the market, and then they must be labeled. And I would point out that I don't have a problem with biotechnology. Genetic engineering, because they really have no way of where they're inserting things, all sorts of things can go wrong. But marker-assisted breeding, that's using molecular techniques and has done wonderful things, has put downy mildew resistant into pigeon peas for the poor in India. Submergent tolerant rice has actually been developed. Pamela Ronald was the one that identified the gene. Ironically, she tried to engineer it into rice, and it didn't work. It had to be Erie doing marker-assisted breeding, moving it in via conventional breeding, and they used biotech because they were able to scan hundreds of thousands of transformants very, very, very quickly. So do I think there are forms of biotechnology in science that can be used? Absolutely, but they need to be used in an intelligent way. And then finally, I would say in many developing countries, whether it's Asia or Africa, talk to the farmer organizations over there. Talk to the peasant organizations. They are very questionable about this technology. They want more agroecological approaches, and many of the decisions we do at the international level, we are working with Via Campesina, with the local peasant and other organizations. So in the Philippines or in India, many of their NGOs, and I would just admit in Africa, for example, 400 NGOs came out a few weeks ago, and they were down on genetic engineering and wanted more of this agroecology, which has actually done some pretty good things in Africa. So if you want to know what farmers and the poor want, go talk to them. Don't talk to the elites in countries that are trying to tell you that technology is the answer.
Last licks.
So Twitter style, first of all, thanks for having me. And to the audience, thank you for listening. Right? Normally when I talk to a group who's not quite sure about GM, I'm booed or people walk out. So thanks for staying and thanks for hearing me out. And I mean that, right? I truly mean that. I want to hear from you, and I really appreciate you listening to me. The marker-assisted breeding that Margaret and Michael are talking about, absolutely. We need every tool in the toolbox. Let's see where we are in 10 years with technology in feeding the world. Yield, distribution, less waste, whatever, right? We all need to be working together. We all need to have good brains in that regard. The last thing that I would say is just a cautionary note on regulation. There's a reason, one of the reasons that there are 6 ag biotech companies, multinational companies that I represent, is because the regulation is so expensive. So when we move forward with these new technologies, when we move forward with mandatory FDA review, I just said we support that. I think the first question we need to ask is there a risk? And if there is a risk, how do we regulate it? Rather than, because it's genetic engineering, nanotechnology, whatever, synthetic biology, there's an inherent risk. Because when it takes years to get a crop to market, and it takes right now about $36 million for a product to get through the regulatory system, it really kind of puts a chill on public and private institutions' ability to devote resources into a product. And that is true for biotech today. It will be true for the technologies that are coming in the future if we don't first ask, is there a risk? So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your questions.
Thank you.
Please fill out your surveys.
I mean, even the big companies are going.